For most of the 1990s, the Walt Disney Company appeared structurally sound. Its governance model was conventional, its leadership hierarchy was stable, its financial performance, while uneven in places, remained sufficient to support expansion across media, theme parks, consumer products, and international licensing. Internally, decision-making authority was concentrated, but not unusually so for a global entertainment company shaped by creative cycles and long-term capital investments. At the center of that structure stood Michael Eisner. Eisner became Disney's chief executive officer in 1984, following a period of strategic drift after the death of Walt Disney and the departure of his immediate successors. His early tenure was widely regarded as a recovery phase. The company expanded aggressively into film, television, and branded consumer experiences. Disney acquired ABC and ESPN. Animation entered a commercial renaissance. Shareholder returns improved materially. By the mid-1990s, Eisner's leadership was not controversial. It was institutionalized. The board of directors was largely aligned with management. Internal dissent existed, but it was bounded by performance metrics that continued to justify continuity. Succession planning was discussed, but not urgently. Eisner was seen as both the architect of Disney's revival and its stabilizing force. The first material shift did not begin with a crisis. It began with a reallocation of power. In 1994, Disney hired Michael Ovitz as president. Ovitz was a high-profile executive, widely connected within Hollywood, and perceived as a potential successor to Eisner. The appointment was framed as a strategic reinforcement of leadership capacity rather than a transition plan. Internally, however, the arrangement created structural ambiguity. Ovitz's compensation package was unusually generous and contractually complex. His authority overlapped with Eisner's in practice, but not clearly in governance terms. Decision rights were not cleanly separated. Reporting lines remained informal. Creative and financial approvals continued to route through Eisner. The partnership deteriorated quickly. By 1996, Ovitz was dismissed. The severance cost was substantial and highly visible. More important than the financial impact was the governance signal it sent. The board approved the termination and the payout, but did so with limited independent scrutiny of how the situation had developed or why controls had failed. From that point forward, Eisner's authority was more concentrated than before. The president role was eliminated. Direct oversight of key divisions reverted to the CEO. Several senior executives departed over the following years, often without clear successors. Decision-making became narrower, not broader. At the time, this was not framed as a governance weakness. Disney's financial results remained acceptable. Its brand equity was intact. The board continued to defer to management's judgment. But internally, the system had become dependent on a single executive's discretion. By the early 2000s, Disney's operating environment had shifted. The animation division was under pressure from new competitors using different production models. Theme park capital expenditures were rising, while marginal returns flattened. ABC's ratings performance became inconsistent. ESPN remained strong but increasingly dominant within the portfolio, creating internal resource allocation tensions. None of these developments were existential. Collectively, however, they strained the coherence of Disney's strategy. Inside the company, senior executives raised concerns about process rather than outcomes. Long-term planning discussions were increasingly informal. Creative approvals were centralized. Dissenting perspectives were perceived as misalignment rather than contribution. At the board level, these signals were not initially treated as governance issues. Eisner was both CEO and chairman of the board. This dual role was not uncommon at the time, but it limited the board's ability to independently evaluate management performance. Agenda-setting authority rested with the same individual responsible for execution. As results softened in some segments, the board's response was incremental. Compensation structures were adjusted. Strategic reviews were commissioned. No structural changes were made to leadership oversight. The assumption remained that performance volatility was cyclical rather than systemic. In 2003, Roy E. Disney, nephew of Walt Disney and a longtime board member, resigned from the board. His resignation was not sudden. It followed years of internal disagreement regarding creative direction, succession planning, and governance structure. Unlike other directors, Roy Disney carried symbolic authority rooted in the company's founding identity. Upon leaving the board, he publicly criticized Eisner's leadership. The critique was not framed as personal conflict. It focused on governance mechanics, the concentration of power, the absence of a credible succession plan, and what Roy Disney described as an erosion of Disney's creative culture. This marked a transition point. For the first time in years, internal governance disputes became visible to shareholders. Proxy advisory firms began to scrutinize Disney's board composition more closely. Institutional investors asked questions not about quarterly earnings, but about oversight and accountability. The board's response was cautious. Directors defended Eisner publicly while acknowledging the need for review. Privately, discussions intensified regarding the separation of the CEO and chairman roles. No immediate action was taken. The company continued to operate. Revenues remained substantial. There was no collapse, no singular failure that forced intervention. The pressure accumulated through process. In March 2004, Disney held its annual shareholder meeting. At that meeting, a non-binding vote was conducted regarding Eisner's retention as chairman of the board. Approximately 43% of shares withheld support for his reelection as chairman. By historical standards, this was an extraordinary signal. The vote did not remove Eisner from his executive role. It did not mandate governance change, but it indicated a breakdown in confidence among a significant portion of Disney's owners. The board could not treat the outcome as symbolic. Within days, the directors announced that Eisner would step down as chairman while remaining CEO. A lead independent director was appointed to assume the chairmanship. This separation addressed one governance concern, but left the core question unresolved: whether Eisner remained the appropriate executive to lead the company forward. Internally, the adjustment altered dynamics. Eisner retained operational control, but no longer controlled the board's agenda. Directors had greater latitude to initiate evaluation processes. Executive succession planning became unavoidable rather than theoretical. The change did not stabilize the situation, it reframed it. Over the next year, the board conducted a series of internal reviews. These were not framed as investigations. They focused on leadership effectiveness, organizational structure, and long-term strategy. External consultants were involved. Benchmarking against peer companies increased. One issue emerged repeatedly: continuity risk. Disney's leadership bench was thin. Several potential successors had departed. Others lacked cross-divisional authority. Eisner's centralized control had produced operational coherence but limited leadership development. From a governance perspective, this was a structural vulnerability. The board faced a constrained set of options. Immediate removal of the CEO risked destabilizing the organization. Retention without a clear transition plan risked prolonging the problem. The decision space narrowed. In late 2004, Eisner announced that he would step down as CEO in 2006. The board accepted the timeline. A succession process formally began. However, the announcement did not resolve tensions. Shareholders questioned why a CEO whose leadership had been publicly challenged would remain in place for an extended transition. Internally, executives hesitated to align with a leadership structure already scheduled for replacement. Authority eroded gradually. By early 2005, the board concluded that the transition period was unsustainable. Operational decisions increasingly required board mediation. External negotiations, including potential strategic partnerships, were complicated by uncertainty about future leadership. The company's negotiating position weakened in subtle but material ways. In March 2005, the board asked Eisner to step down as CEO effective September of that year, earlier than initially planned. The decision was presented as mutual and orderly. Eisner agreed to remain in an advisory capacity during the transition. There was no abrupt dismissal, no public confrontation. From a governance standpoint, the outcome reflected accumulated constraints rather than a decisive break. The board had not identified a single disqualifying failure. Instead, it acted on the conclusion that the existing leadership structure no longer supported the company's long-term interests. Bob Iger, then president and COO, was named CEO. Eisner's departure did not immediately transform Disney's performance. The company's strategic direction evolved gradually. Some initiatives were reversed, others continued with modifications. What changed more clearly was the governance framework. The separation of CEO and chairman roles became normalized. Succession planning was treated as a continuous process rather than an episodic concern. Board independence increased, both formally and in practice. In retrospect, the episode illustrates a particular type of institutional conflict. There was no scandal, no regulatory intervention, no collapse in financial performance that forced emergency action. The conflict unfolded through governance mechanics, board composition, executive authority, shareholder signaling, and succession risk. The removal of Disney's CEO in the mid-2000s was not the result of a single decision or event. It was the outcome of a system that had become too dependent on continuity to adapt smoothly when conditions changed. From the outside, the transition appeared orderly. Internally, it reflected years of unresolved structural tension. The company continued. The institution absorbed the change. What remained was a record of how stability, when left unexamined, can quietly become a constraint.